Professor of Religion and Director of Afro-American Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey, Cornel West has come to be regarded as a preeminent philosopher and orator on American society. He returns to our broadcast to share his views on our nation's continuing struggle with race and racism, and it's always good to have him here. Welcome.
I'd like to congratulate you on the one dynamite year of high-quality conversation and look forward to the national audience after January 4th.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to it, too.
On behalf of many, many people.
Whatever success we've had here, you've helped contribute to it. Let me talk about, we just had the anniversary, the first-year anniversary of Hill Thomas. Mike Tyson's in jail. We had the reaction to the Rodney King verdict. I mean, I noticed these things, okay? One, it is a black woman testifying against a black man nominee to the highest court in the land. One. Two, Mike Tyson, black woman testifying against, boom, black man now in jail. Three, Rodney King, a lot of violence. A lot of that violence turned out to be black against black. My point in all this is there any message in all of this? Is there anything to understand when we look back over this year before we get to some of the questions as to how the white community in America is reacting to race in America?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there's great wisdom in a statement by the major writer Richard Wright when he said the Negro is a metaphor for America. He was using the term Negro at that particular time. But what he was getting at in part, I think, was that the quality of life in America and the measure of success of this democratic experiment has much to do with the plight and predicament of black people. And so though one may run or attempt to escape, the quality of one's life is still deeply affected by the doings and sufferings of black people. And similarly so in terms of what a common good and public interest in this nation is. And so this notion of black people being a kind of metaphor for America is, I think, quite telling.
Telling in what way?
Telling in the sense that when we see nihilism in black America, a certain degree of meaninglessness and hopelessness, that it's in many ways a mirror of levels of destruction and self-destruction in other arenas and other spheres in the country as a whole. When we see escalating crime, for example, in the black community, we also see escalating crime in the larger society. When we see drug abuse, that mirrors a larger spiritual crisis in the country. And so the crucial point here is the degree to which our lives are so deeply interwoven. And therefore, we must always refuse to simply look at the black condition and all of its variety as somehow being thoroughly separate from or severed from the lives of all other Americans.
You say this in another way, too, and I've read this, a piece you wrote, I think, in the New York Times. But you make the point that it's important for all of us not to say there is a black problem, an Afro-American problem, African-American problem, and therefore you have got to do what you have to do to become part of the mainstream of America, when your point is that African-Americans are constituent members of this country, and that therefore the push should not to be necessarily, help me out.
That's what I mean. Black people are the fundamental creators of the country. We didn't create it by ourselves, but we play such a fundamental role in creating the country and making it what it is. And on a moral level, making the ideals of democracy real in a substantive way. That the critique of the American racial caste system was an attempt to build on the ideal of democracy at its best. And given the fact that the country is premised on a democratic promise, a notion that ordinary people ought to be participating in the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives, the black freedom struggle has itself been democracy at its best, and hence to that degree it has helped make America what it is, and that process, as we know, is an endless one and still has far to go.
Where do you see hope?
I see hope in the eyes of young people who are willing to fight for democratic ideals. I see hope in the eyes of those white Americans who refuse to be marginalized and silenced in their efforts to bring certain critiques to bear on racial domination and male domination and so on. I mean, these days there's a lot of talk, you know, about I think Sister Soldier, in fact, raises this with great power, and I have great respect for Sister Soldier, but where are the white do-gooders in this regard? And the legacy of a John Brown or an Elijah Lovejoy, the legacy of a Miles Horton, Highlander Center. You may have seen just last week, Don West died. He's a white brother from West Virginia whose house was burned down every 4 years or so by the Ku Klux Klan in his struggle against racism. These white freedom fighters are in no way paradigmatic of white America. There's not enough white Americans who are part of their tradition. But that tradition is there. Ann Braden is another. One could go on. And I see that particular group growing. Deep concern. Why? Because they recognize, in fact, that the relative success and the relative failure of the democratic experience may rest, indeed, on how we confront the challenge of racism.
To do what?
Well, part of it part of it is that the issue of race is inseparable from the issue of the distribution of wealth and power in the society. It's impossible to talk about race. It's impossible to talk about the plight of people of African descent in this country without raising the fundamental issue of what are the mechanisms of accountability for the powerful and the wealthy. And again, not demonizing.
Okay, but let me ask you this. Do you believe that you can eliminate racism in a capitalist society?
Well, I think eliminate racism is a bit too strong. I want to alleviate it.
Okay, alleviate.
I mean, I'm a Christian, right? I don't believe in paradise on earth by human creation and human agency, but I do believe we can make major blows against it. Same is true in regard to patriarchy and homophobia as well. We can push it back. Now, can it be done within a capitalist society? Well, there's no doubt that in a capitalist society you're going to have deeply market-driven behavior.
Okay, but the reason I raise that point is what you just said. My argument came because you just said the fact that it seemed to be that racism was so connected to, you know, the economic system we have.
Yes, no, that's real, though. That's very, very real. And I don't think, though, one has to move into abstract arguments about capitalism as if it's some monolithic abstraction resting above the everyday activities of ordinary human beings.
Just a market economy?
That it's a market economy. Markets are necessary conditions for the preservation of liberty, there's no doubt, but they're not sufficient conditions. Meaning what? Meaning that we have still got to look in the face the fact that 1% of the population owns 37% of the wealth, that 10% of the population owns 86% of the wealth. Now, we've got to do it constitutionally, we've got to do it legally, we've got to do it politically, but I do not think that the American experience is going to make it in the 21st century in good health.
Unless?
With that kind of distribution of wealth and power, not given our culture industry.
Is that why you're
throwing out messages?
Is that why you're a socialist?
That's why I'm a radical Democrat. I mean, democratic
What's the difference in a socialist and a radical Democrat?
I mean, I'm one of the honorary chair of Democratic Socialists of America, and quite proud of it, of course. But I think Michael Harrington said it well in his last book, a powerful text actually entitled Socialism, Past and Future, when he said, he uses the term democratic socialism as a way of signifying human hope for freedom and justice under the unprecedented conditions of the 21st century. So he didn't want to fall into any petty ideological games. He said, how do we keep track of the causes of social misery, of poor white brothers and sisters in Appalachia, of poor Asians in Chinatown, of poor black brothers and sisters in Harlem and South Side of Chicago, of the poor Latinos in Washington Heights, that their destiny,
how do we keep track of them?
To keep track of the causes of the social misery that they have to confront every day. And it's a question I think we all have to grapple together. I do not believe that any of us have the answer, the solution, or the panacea for this. But at least we have to raise the issue. I mean, look at the presidential campaign nowadays. When have they talked about the inner cities? What
well,
do they have
I'll
to
tell
say
you when they
about
talk
Los
about it.
Angeles
Jack Kemp has
Jack
talked
Kemp
about
is
it, talked about
marginal
enterprise.
into the Bush
He's a marginal.
camp.
Okay, he's a marginal
to
voice.
the Bush camp. You're absolutely right. I mean, I respect
but he's talked about
his
enterprise
intervention and so
and
forth. I might
empowerment
not
and
be
all those
persuaded
things.
by his arguments, but at least he's talking about it.
Okay, but and Jack Kemp is he's, you know, I mean, he is one who swears by the market and believes that the market is the solution to most of our ills, and that's in fact what he wants to do. And in fact, if you look at what he's done in housing projects, and what he believes in St. Louis and other places, he believes that in fact giving people an opportunity to, you know, engage in the market and participate in the market will change the way they live. Right?
I mean, there's some insights there. I mean, there's some insights there.
Could you buy that? Could you go along with that?
Well, I would want to highlight not only the ways in which market mechanisms can broaden the scope of choice for individuals. I think there are some insights there, and we can learn from Kemp and Friedman and others, but to a very limited degree, there's still constraints on those market mechanisms. That the enterprise zones will work only when there's certain lucrative incentives in place for business to do this. Government, the public sphere will still have to play a role, so we're talking about a partnership.
But you can't deny that, in fact, I mean, we came here, I went to talk about race and not economics, and you put them together, so that's why we're talking about economics. Well, you can't deny that people are more, this is Kemp's point, that people, and others though, that people are more careful about their own property, right?
Oh, no doubt, no doubt.
You know?
I mean, that's one of the insights I accept.
Right.
From Kemp and others.
No, okay. Now, but let's say Clinton and Bush. I mean, Bush keeps talking about he believes in entrepreneurship and all of that, and that's what will, you know, all tides rise, all boats, I guess, is the notion.
Yeah,
all of that.
Look at the evidence.
It's like it's the opposite of trickle down, I guess. And therefore, but Clinton has. I mean, what about Clinton? You see no discussion of. On part of the Clinton
not
campaign?
Of the inner city. Not on the inner city. You don't hear Clinton addressing the issues at the Senator Bradley.
Why do you think that is?
I think that he wants to win, and he feels as if it's going to be a suburban electorate that will tilt the balance one way or the other.
He wants to get those Reagan Democrats, the middle-class Democrats back?
So he wants to hold at arm's length some of these deep pressing problems facing the country, like inner city.
Well, does he want them holding at arm's length, or he feels like that he better go out and appeal to this?
Well, I mean, I don't know. See, I don't know Governor Clinton. I've never met him and talked to him. I would like to be charitable and to think that he's using a language and rhetoric to win, but he's got in his heart and on his mind some of these very pressing issues.
But then how do you, let's take Clinton just for example, because I mean, you know, Bush has got some people, Lewis Sullivan and others, and he appointed, you know, a number of people, I guess. But Clinton's got a lot of African Americans who are supporting him.
More out of default than with
I don't think John Lewis out of default. Do you think? I don't think people like John Lewis.
Case history. No, I think you're right. He's one of the exceptions who really believes that Clinton is somebody who's going to make a fundamental difference. You're right. John Lewis, I think, would be one of the exceptions.
And Mike Espy and those were the early people that rallied around him.
Well, Espy, of course, given his relation to the DLC for a long time, would already be part
DLC
of that
is a
group,
moderate organization that had a lot of Southern governors and people like that.
Neutralizing Jesse Jackson and so forth. John Lewis is quite different.
Okay. Do you think we are essentially a conservative society?
Yes, in many ways. In many ways. I think economically, the sacred cow of this country has been economic growth by means of corporate priorities.
Yeah.
And those who call that into question find themselves deeply marginalized. And I do believe, I mean, corporations are very complex institutions. We don't want to view them in any homogeneous way. We're at a moment now, I think, in our history where we're forced to acknowledge the degree to which corporations are going to play a fundamental role because so many other of our institutions are falling apart. They're collapsing.
Like what? What institutions?
Oh, the government, the institutions in the public sphere seem to...
You mean in the sense that they have less respect in terms of, therefore less public support and less credibility?
Erosion of trust of the citizenry in these institutions, very much so. But look at our families, look at our schools, look at our neighborhoods, look at our civic associations, you see.
Why shouldn't family values be an issue? I mean, why shouldn't family values be an issue and not a code word in American politics?
See, family values,
not as defined by a Republican National Convention or a Democratic National Convention, but as something that you, as a Christian, believe would be important, whether you're talking about a single-parent family or whatever. Values are an important concept of Christianity, are they not?
Fundamental. That's why, for me, we're talking about moral values applied to whatever institution we're talking about.
Right.
I mean, I come from one of the most precious families imaginable, but I don't think in terms of family value. I think in terms of the effective bonds, the love and care and support that's provided for me in such a way that is far beyond what I deserve. But that's moral values, right? And when we talk about family values, rather than what is the moral content of these family values, what's the ethical substance of these family values, then we're back to the Republican National Convention, and we've got this name calling and this finger pointing and this.
Yeah, but you know the problem I have with that.
So that certainly families are very important. Yeah. We've got to talk about the effective bonds.
And if family values are important in terms of who had hope and the climate and the cultural environment that existed in Los Angeles. I mean, you know, you and I talked at that time, and you were on broadcast with me in terms of what sparked so many of those young people out there. You know, how do you distinguish between rage and criminal conduct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question about criminal conduct.
And can you raise those questions without being
doing something wrong?
You bet. And that's a moral value that,
no doubt about
and
it,
an
both
ethical
moral
value
and legal that we have to hold on to.
inflict violence against another person is anti-Christian, is it not?
It's just wrong. It's anti-Christian. It's anti-religious. Most religions that we know.
Right.
You're absolutely right about that. But again, as we know, you see that without in any way allowing a person to get off the hook, it's got to be applied fairly across the board.
Yeah.
That's true for the police. That's true for our economic institutions and so forth.
Okay. Let me just, how much time I got? I got 1 minute. If I had to make one, beyond the economic disparity, which you talked about, which is a serious problem in this country, that the gulf that separates rich and poor, you know, and the control that the rich have over the resources of this country. Beyond that, what's the most important thing we need to do to come to grips? What's our first step, our first recognition to come to grips with racism in this country? Leave me with something in 30 seconds.
I would think that we would have to recognize that race is not simply a political or social problem. It is a disease of the soul. And that disease of the soul that historically has been a white supremacist assault on black beauty and intelligence and character is one that is overcome only by means of conversion.
Conversion to what?
Conversion to an ideal in which one treats human beings like one would like to be treated. And that's a long, long process, but it's possible. It's always.
Is that the golden rule?
It's the golden rule. That's exactly right. One of the most subversive claims ever put forward.
Thank you, man.
Thank you so
Professor
very much.
Cornel West.
Thank you very much, sir.
We will return in a moment with an interview I recently taped with maestro and music legend Daniel Barenboim, conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra.